Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to class this morning. We're glad that you're here. Got a couple announcements before we get started. Mission Monday is going to be tomorrow, 6 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. in the annex. The Summer Youth Series is Tuesday, 7 p.m. We're hosting the Summer Youth Series that evening, and everyone is invited. Silverliners, Friday, 11:30 a.m. We're collecting Bibles for South Africa. And so if you have a new or slightly used Bible that you'd like to contribute to that, I know the last time they did it, they fill up a container full of Bibles, and it's took a few years to pass them out, but it's time for more. And then the little cans of change for Potter's Children's Home, this is the last month for that. So you need to bring those in by July 30th. And there are a couple of empty cans if you'd like. Let's see. I got it back up here. We're at the end. We're not almost done. You can see in reverse what we're going to talk about. Okay. So we're going to talk about last week. We were on the restoration movement. We talked a little bit about slogans. I think the key takeaway there is those were more applicable back then. You think about it, that was a long time ago. And we had a visitor make a comment about, well, if you focused on the slogan more than you focused on the Bible, then you could turn that slogan into a creed. And we're not about creed. So we got to be cautious about slogans and be more mindful of focusing on what the Bible teaches in obedience to the Bible. We are going to talk a little bit about restoration, a little bit more today. We think about the early church and how we got here, and that's what we're kind of how did we get to the Church of Christ? And there's some big names, and they're on the screen. Barton Stone, 1790. He came along, and in 1801 they had the Cane Ridge Revival. It's Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and I think Jim Fawn's speaking there. Sorry. All right, so they already spoke there, not back in 1801, but last week. So they still have meetings over there. So, and it's interesting if you study this. I've been trying to work up a whole class, and we can't spend a whole quarter on restoration movement. That's not our goal this time, but a lot of it is in Kentucky. And so one of the things we'd like to do is have a class on that, and then maybe get up a bus tour and go see some of these places. So in 1803, Stone and others withdrew from the Kentucky Presbytery. They were Presbyterians, and they wrote the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbyterian at Cane Ridge. So they were like, this is the end of that. We're moving forward. They wanted to focus on the Bible. And they wanted to focus on unity around Jesus. So in 1804, we're real early 1800s, Elias Smith heard of the Stone movement and the O'Kelly movements that were around that time, 1808, and those three groups merged in 1810. And that there were about 20,000 members at that point in time. And they were called the Christian Connection or the Christian Church. So then we hear a lot about the Campbells, Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell. So you have Thomas Campbell published the Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington in 1809. So people were writing papers trying to state, here's what we need to do. We need to move back towards the Bible. We need to move towards unity. So he organized a Christian Association of Washington in Washington County, Pennsylvania. So the Campbells were kind of in Pennsylvania. Other ones were in Kentucky. And then Thomas' son, Alexander, came to the U.S. in 1809. and they worked with the Redstone Baptist Association from 1815 to 1824. And they had a publication called the Christian Baptist, which promoted reform. So you have the Stone and the Campbell movements, and then they come together, and this is where a lot of people are going to say, well, that's where we came from. Okay, and in fact, you look at that, and they merged in 1832 at the Hill Street Meeting House in Lexington, Kentucky. And so the two of them came together trying to focus on the Bible and on unity as their model. And they had a handshake that sealed the deal. You had Raccoon Smith there. You had other players in this. You think, well, there we go, 1832. But we got to take a side path. Sometimes when we get down to see Rose's folks, her mom goes to a little congregation on Sunday morning called the Rocky Springs Church of Christ. And it's just over the line. They live in Jasper, Tennessee, but I don't know, 10, 15 miles away, you cross over into Alabama, and just a couple miles into Alabama is Rocky Springs. So we've been talking about 1832. Well, let's go back to 1807. So Thomas Jefferson was president. Our country is 31 years old. This is back there, right? And you had you don't have all the states yet. You're before the War of 1812. So this is back in time. And you have a number of Presbyterian and Episcopalian folks who moved from North Carolina into the Tennessee River Valley. And they created a church there in Summerhouse Mountain, a community called Antioch, in 1807. So this 1807 is before 1832, the Alexander Barton Stone movement where they combined. So there's a man named William Price. He was baptized in 1811 in Old Philadelphia, Tennessee. And the bottom line is they moved to this community of Rocky Springs, and they established a church there, a church that followed the Bible. If you remember, last week we talked about the remnant. And I want people to think about that there have been folks, you don't have to have, we showed the sort of the map, the handout of, in a way, how we got here. But I also want folks to think about that's not how everyone got here. There are folks who got here by studying their Bible and trying to do what it said. So you have this congregation that started in Alabama. They moved in 1847 to Rocky Springs from where they were in Tennessee. They had 82 members. So here's what I'll talk when I say the remnant. Here's a group of people that just read their Bible and said, look, this is what we need to do. So they had elders. By June 1851, they'd grown to 130 members, which is pretty neat for a rural little church. Now the Civil War came along, and the Civil War, their building got destroyed. Church building was burned by the Union Army, and then they built a new building in 1870. And by 1875, they needed to have a new building because they'd overgrown the old one. 5 years, and they'd overgrown it. And the current building that's there was built in 1912. So a lot of neat history at this building. Now they've added onto the building a little bit since then. They added indoor bathroom, which I find a good thing. But to think about that there are congregations that started out before the Stone and Campbell movements, it's pretty neat to think about. There are folks that can go along and just study their Bible and try to do the right thing. And that's the point that I was wanting to make about the remnant. There are folks that have gone along and have done this, and that's, I'm sure, not the only example, but it's one where been able to go there, and they still worship there today. I think it's the oldest congregation in the state of Alabama. Okay, let's talk about, and again, I enjoyed the discussion last week, so if you want to make some comments, just jump in, because we're good with discussion. So you have the early church comes along, the Restoration movement, but then there's trouble in paradise. You have different groups you had with slightly different focuses. So you have the disciples of Christ, the Christian church, and the Church of Christ. And there's a little different focus, and then there are issues that come along today that we sometimes think are new. Like today, we struggle with, there's places that want to have instrumental music, and you might go less than 1,000 miles and find a congregation that's got instrumental music now, and maybe they still call themselves Church of Christ, and maybe they don't. Instrumental music came along in about 1849, and it was in the church at Midway, Kentucky by 1860. So instrumental music isn't new. You've had people question how to interpret the Bible. Is the Bible completely inspired by God? You've had folks concerned, or what they called open membership, which is recognizing members who had not been baptized by immersion. So you have different things that are going on. And the difference, let's talk about this just a minute. The disciples of Christ, which are closely related, their focus was more on unity, and the Church of Christ was focused more on the restoration, restoring the New Testament church. So that's kind of the difference you see there. And that was formally recognized as the difference in 1906. So you started seeing churches of Christ listed in the census as compared, and also listed separately from disciples of Christ in the 1906 census. Another issue that we have today that was an issue back then, we think of it today, is women leadership. And we're going to talk about women leadership and their role in the church here in a few weeks. I look forward to that. But there were groups way back, we're talking 1906, 1908. There were the Christian Women's Board of Missions and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were mostly on churches more in the north, and they were women's activist churches. So we think now, okay, you've got some pressure for women to lead and be leaders, and that's not new. Just bear in mind that a lot of this stuff's been out there. Another separation I want to talk a little bit about, one that's a little on the personal side. Before I jump in that, I don't see Jeff this morning, but Jeff, I'll throw this out. Jeff asked a question yesterday: how many members are there of the Church of Christ? And in 2022, there were 1.7 million to 2 million worldwide, 11,776 congregations, about 1.3 million members in the U.S., and we're the 12th largest religious group in the U.S. One thing of interest is, while you're talking numbers, 70% of the members of the Church of Christ in America live in 13 states. So folks that have traveled around, I know Ron's traveled around, you get out west some places and it's hard to find a congregation. You get around here, you get in Tennessee, and it's easy to find congregations to choose from. So let's talk about one other split that came along. And they call them now the International Church of Christ. I know the slide is probably small print. Sorry for that. This began in Gainesville, Florida, and most of y'all know that I was a alumni of the University of Florida. And this was going on while I was there. You had the Crossroads Church of Christ, Crossroads movement. It had been the 14th Street Church of Christ, so it's not too far from the campus of the University of Florida. And you had a leader named Chuck Lucas, and he started what was called Campus Advance. And it centered on the University of Florida, the students, and it had different ways. It was a very strong evangelistic focus. Now, a strong evangelistic focus isn't a bad thing, but this was at another level. And they would have, obviously, they had Sunday morning worship, they had Wednesday night worship. They would have what were called soul talks in people's homes during the week, a couple times. And you would get assigned what was called a prayer partner. So I had gone to University of Florida for a while, and I'd heard about this cult. You know, the people outside called it a cult. And you're thinking, at the time I wasn't going anywhere for church. I'm like, I got to go check this out. This will be nice time. Let's go see what this is about. And so one quarter, early in the quarter, my senior year, I'd been around, I'd been hearing about it. I go in the cafeteria. I pick an empty table and sat down, and my friends had come by like, hey, what are you doing sitting back? I'm like, leave me alone, get away. I need some room here. And you just give it a couple minutes, and some young lady's going to come up to you and ask if they can sit there, and friendly, and go, hey, you know, do you want to go to church with me? And I'm like, sure, I can do that. And that was how they would recruit folks. They would look for folks who didn't have friends. So if you went in the cafeteria, and it's a big, big cafeteria, there's over 30,000 students at the time. If you were in there by yourself, someone's going to come talk to you. They're going to be friendly. And if you're a student from out of town and you move to this college town and you don't know anybody, it could be a little tough. So that works out, and they invite you to church. They're like, come on to church. I'm like, sure. So you show up at church, and here's this young lady. She goes, I want to introduce you to some of my friends. So the bottom line, she's going to introduce you to about half a dozen guys, and she's going to disappear, and then you're going to go, oh, come on and sit with us. You know, we're your buds, right? And the congregation, there's a lot of rules there. Now, you got to give them credit for trying to be evangelistic, but there's a lot of rules, and the guys sit on one side, the single guys, and the single girls sit on the other side. If you want to get married, it has to be approved by someone up the pyramid. It's a pyramid of control, and you had your prayer partner. Your prayer partner was right in the middle of your life, and they expect you to confess anything you done wrong. They expect you to tell them what's going on. And what I thought was interesting, because you know I was senior, I'd been out on my own for a while, and you do feel that, okay, I got friends now. And if you didn't have any other friends, that would be a certain amount of you know, to hold you in. But it was interesting because you don't think about mind control, and you don't think that someone can come along and influence you like they can. And, you know, you've only been going there for a week or two, and then you miss a soul talk on Thursday night, and they're putting the pressure on you. They're putting the guilt trip on you. And you think about that. If we had a visitor come here and they came on Sunday, and then they're, you know, wish all of our folks were here on Wednesday night, Sunday night, but not everyone here. But let's say they come up on Wednesday and then they miss a Wednesday. You think you could sit down with them and give them a big guilt trip, like, where were you? What's wrong with you? But, you know, you're not right because you missed the service. You missed this little side. We were going to have work day Saturday, and you weren't here. And, you know, they're not going to tell you you're going to Hades because you missed work day, but they put the pressure on. And you wouldn't think someone could do that, but it is professional. It is thought out. It really is what one has to call a cult level. Well, the Crossroads movement evolved from Gainesville. You had a man named Kip McKean. Kip moved to Boston in 1979. That was about the time I was, went on my mission. By the way, I only could stand it for a couple weeks, and I was like, I got to get out of this because this isn't, it's like these people are serious, and I got to go on. So I was disfellowshipped by the Crossroads Church of Christ when I was about 20 years old. Thankfully, years later, I didn't think of them. They just called them Crossroadsers as Church of Christ, or it would have been a negative influence for wanting to be here. But I didn't think of it that way. So you got Kip goes to Boston and creates what's called the Boston movement. And they were the ones that really took off, and it really grew, and he became the one of power. So Chuck Lucas was kind of out, and Kip was in the Boston. And they broke apart in 1980. It's been written up in Time magazine. It would be written up in the local papers. There was coverage of this. They had over 50,000 members in 1993 when they became the International Churches of Christ. So if you see the International Churches of Christ, they do exist. They tend to have a team. They'll send 2 or 3 couples to a college town, and they will either try to create their own congregation, or they will try to get into a small congregation near the local college, and they'll take it over. I know they did that in Chattanooga while we lived in Chattanooga, and they tried to take over a congregation. That congregation regained control away from them and repented of it, and I think they're still there. The Crossroads Church of Christ did repent as a congregation and has said they're a mainstream church now. I'm not going back, but that's how that is. Any questions on the Crossroadsers? Tom? That's a good question. Tom asked about where did the term cult or whatever come from as far as church. I don't believe it was derived from the Crossroadsers. I think you've had I don't remember their name right off. There was the group that went to Guatemala. It was a religious group, and they went down there and then they all committed suicide. They drank the poison Kool-Aid. Obviously, Jim Jones. So you've had folks who, and you have other groups that have, it's just mental influence, and it is, I think, there's probably an official definition, but I don't know it. But it's a general rule. It's a group that gets people in, and they figured out how to keep them in by mental influence that's far beyond the "I'm your friend." Come eat lunch with me. Come to potluck. And Priscilla said it sounded like it had rules similar to the Church of Scientology. I don't know, I'm not studied it, so I can't answer to that. But they had serious rules, and it was very controlling. And then they were like your prayer partner was feeding back information about you up the chain and being told, because they have one above them, and there's one. It's a pyramid, and they're feeding stuff up, they're telling them what to tell you. So it's very controlled. It's real. and you gotta be mindful of this stuff that can be out there. I mean, we're probably not going to come across that here in Paducah, but if you've got kids or you got grandkids that are going off to some, you know, state college town, um, pay some attention to where they want to go to church and just check it out a little bit because things can get off. Jim. Hmm. Right. So Jim was telling us that I'm not the only elder that's been around the crossroads groups. That Kip McKean was planted to create a satellite of the crossroads movement there in Illinois, and was successful with that. I think he was one of the very high level folks in the crossroads movement that successfully did that, and they I think continue to plant churches in college towns. That's their target. Go after the kids. Charles? Right. So so Charles makes a good point. You had the Branch Davidians, like in Waco, Texas, that met their demise there. You've had other of these groups through time, but the point is people might accuse us of being a cult. Um, they can accuse anyone they would like, and we need to be prepared to answer to that. That no, we're not a cult. We go by what the Bible says. You're welcome to come visit and see it. And if you see something wrong with what we're telling you out of the Bible, that's good. Um, and we're not connected with the International Church of Christ. We're not connected to Crossroads. We're not part of that. They were here. Mr. John? Right. Okay. So John makes a good point. You could have someone who differs, who doesn't want to necessarily go by something in the Bible, and accuse you of being a cult just because you want to hold to a strong opinion on the Bible. I will back up slightly when we're on the subject of being accused of stuff. You know, we talked about the Stone and Campbell movements. You might be accused of being a Campbellite, just as you've got Lutherans named after Martin Luther. There are some folks who are going to say, "Oh, you're a Campbellite. You're one of those followers of Alexander Campbell." Um, so you could have that as well. Bridget? So Bridget points out that a few years back that effectively the Church of Christ was put on trial in the media. You had folks that I assume mostly Baptists that differed with opinion, and it was a national level that the church was criticized and made to look bad in the media. And I would say the devil's going to use if you're being successful, the devil's going to attack in any way he can. And if you look at the media, they go after the one of the recent ones is the Methodist, United Methodist, UMC, I think it is, that they're kind of splitting over the issues of women preachers. And the media is going to take that and be critical of that and beat on that drum because they don't like any kind of Christianity here in America today. And so they can be critical of, preachers that sin against their kids. They can be critical of any church that they see as successful because the media in America is not supportive of Christianity. I don't know if that was a good paraphrase of where you were, but Sandy. Sandy had a good point of at a nursing home there was a conflict with another denomination came in and was going to play music on the piano and they were asked to leave, but instead of leaving she went and spoke with them in a kind manner. We have to speak the truth in love. If we don't speak the truth in love, it's not going to work out. But we should be ready to give an answer, but we should never look at this as it's not a fight. You're not going to win that fight. If you have someone with a different religious background and you think I'm right and they're wrong and I'm gonna show them, that doesn't tend to work out. You got to take your time. You got to be patient, be kind and loving, and people. You can plant seeds and people will listen, but you got to plant seeds and take your time. Sandy. And Sandy added too that she's been to a town where they weren't as Catholics, and you're not going to have success reaching them. We've been in Utah where there are a lot of Mormons, and it's mostly what's there. That still doesn't mean you can't reach people. That just means it might be more of a challenge. But we can't let things hold us back. Say, well, it's not going to be easy. God didn't say the path was easy. God told us to plant seeds. We're not responsible for if those seeds are productive. That's not what we're told to do. We're told to plant seeds. God will give the increase. And that's what it's about. We need to be kind. We need to speak the truth in love. Good discussion. Good discussion. Let's move on. We've spent a couple weeks without a whole lot of scripture, and it's supposed to be a Bible study class. So we're going to get into the first. This is kind of the next section. We talked some about the authority of the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible. We talked some about how we got here. And now we want to start talking about some topics. Some of these topics people are going to disagree with. Most, hopefully not folks that are attending here, but people may not be familiar with or have studied it. And so we want to look at some of these topics. And the first one is why we worship on the first day of the week. You know, when you look at the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments were the old law. We talked about old law, New Testament. 10 Commandments were pretty much all repeated in the New Testament except for the old law. They were told to worship on or to keep what day holy? Sabbath. What day of the week is the Sabbath? Saturday. So there's a lot of folks go, well, we're keeping the Sabbath. No, we're not. We're first day of the week, not the Sabbath, which was the last day of the week. So they were told to rest on the last day of the week. We are told to worship on the first day of the week. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 tells us, now concerning the collection of the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there may be no collecting when I come. So here we have a verse that talks specifically about on the first day of the week in the collection. We think about the pieces of worship, and one of the pieces of worship is the collection. John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. So when we worship, we're supposed to worship in spirit. We're supposed to worship in truth. We're supposed to do what's right. There can be vain worship, and there are many folks that do not focus on worshiping according to the truth, according to the Bible. Another verse, Acts chapter 20, verse 7, tells us on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. Well, what's gathering? What's breaking bread? The Lord's Supper. Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. So you have, again, they met on the first day of the week, the early church, the example of the early church. So we talk about breaking bread, we talk about the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 34, we see a common discussion of the Lord's Supper. You may not hear those verses every week, but I'm sure before the month's out, someone is going to reference 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and talk about the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16 and 17 tells us, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we partake of the one bread. So we have one bread, we break the bread as part of the Lord's Supper, and we do that on the first day of the week. And we see, we're going to see some of our religious friends who don't want to have the Lord's Supper every week. Want to do it once a month, or some do it once a quarter, and they're going to give reasons like, well, if we do that, if we have it every week, then people just are going to get used to it or bored with it, and if we do it less often, it'll be special. We can focus on it, and minds will be focused, and it'll be so much better if we do that. Oh, let's pick a time. Let's do it every 9.5 weeks. And I just made up that number. It obviously makes no sense, right? Well, it tells us right here to do it on the first day of the week. So that's why we do it on the first day of the week. Not because we think it's better or it'll have a better emphasis if we did it less often. It's not our choice. Right? And it would, Tom made the comment that he goes, would that be like saying I'm just going to pray once a year and it'll be really special? It would be really special, but a really bad idea. Right? We need to pray without ceasing. Charles? Yeah, Charles makes a great point. We need a constant weekly reminder. It's remember me. Well, how do you learn something? How do you remember something? Repetition. And yeah, Charles mentioned sometimes his mind wanders during Lord's Supper. Mine too. Everyone's going to have that. Unless you're a whole lot more disciplined than I am, your mind can wander. But it doesn't mean you sit there for the whole 5 or 10 minutes thinking about lunch. We need to focus our mind. We need to work at that by focusing and being there and participating in the Lord's Supper. And having it every week is going to help with remembering that, and overcoming those lapses is something we work on. I know that was the second bell. I appreciate all of the comments. And next week, we're going to talk about instrumental music. So bring your comments.